So, what evasive entrepreneurialism is the idea that there are certain innovators who are in the business of trying to change or shape the law and regulation by operating strategically in a way that is at the borders of legality or is challenging law and regulation in creative ways. It isn't always necessarily breaking the law outright, but it's pushing up against the law in creative or aggressive ways. And so evasive entrepreneurs have always been part of an economy. Sometimes they've been part of an underground economy, but sometimes they are just operating in creative ways to sort of like say, well, there's a permitting process, but we're going to go through it differently. We're going to try to do this and then ask you for, forgiveness later if we mess up, kind of thing. And so the sharing economy is a pretty good example in recent years of, how evasive entrepreneurialism works, where ride sharing companies and space sharing companies basically started to go out and just offer, rides to people or space to rent in ways that it wasn't clear if it was legal. And so it's an interesting story to think about how Uber and Lyft and those companies started doing that with ride sharing, because for the better part of 70 years or so, there were many people, many economists and political scientists who had proven that taxi cab regulation and limo regulation was a very anti-consumer kind of policy. It limited competition, it raised prices, it kept quality low. And everybody agreed on this. Everybody, except for the taxi commissions and the taxi cab companies. They liked their little cartel. And even the federal government in the United States actually agreed with economists and political scientists that this system should be reformed of state and local regulations favoring taxi cab interests. But nothing ever changed, despite compelling evidence that this was an anti-consumer system. Well, all of a sudden, after decades of this and nothing changes, along comes Uber and Lyft, and overnight everything changed. Everything changed in that field because they were evasive entrepreneurs. They decided to go ahead and let the public try these new technologies out. And guess what? The public liked choice and competition and better prices and better quality.
And
And
Uber was even really deliberate about that, right? So,
Mhm.
not sure if you read the book by Bradley Tusk, who did Uber's regulatory strategy then, but they knew very clearly what they were doing and where they were up against. So they had like a deliberate media and PR strategy that was working with their users in the districts where they wanted to get sort of the regulators and to back off, right? So they were very strategic about using their fans, their users, after they've gotten them, involved and using into the product to advocate for them.
In fact, Bradley Tusk, I talk about this story in my book on evasive entrepreneurialism. When he was working with Uber in New York City, they had a strategy to take on the mayor of New York City, who at the time was Bill de Blasio. And Mayor de Blasio and the New York City Council was pushing rules that would have limited the ability of Uber and Lyft to compete in Manhattan, downtown New York, that is. And so what Uber did, and Bradley Tusk was a part of this, is that overnight they recoded the app, the Uber app, on their for smartphones, so that when you went to your slider to pick a car on Manhattan Island in New York City, there was a slider option that said de Blasio mode. And when you slid your slider over from Uber X to Uber Black Car to de Blasio mode, it said no cars available in New York City because Bill de Blasio gets his way.
Amazing.
And then it said, if you don't want that result, call your local congressperson at this number. The next day, Bill de Blasio and the New York City Council changed their position. And basically what Uber had done is they had enlisted their consumers as citizen lobbyists to go and make their case for them with New York policymakers. So what I argue in my book on evasive entrepreneurs, building on that example and many, many others, is that this doesn't mean that laws completely go away. It doesn't mean we live in anarchy after this. What changes is the political leverage of innovators. The question is, how do entrepreneurs get a fair chance? How do they get a chance to go out and try something new? If they can't reform a broken old political system and no laws are being changed, well, you're left with this really hard decision. Do we give up, move to another country, or do we just try it? And what evasive entrepreneurs sometimes do is they do it, the public loves it, it changes the dynamic, and then it changes the political leverage they have to advocate for more reform or a little bit more freedom in this world.